across a category of amendments to the U.S. Constitution called unratified amendments. That is,
amendments that Congress had proposed for ratification,
but that not enough states ever approved to become part of the Constitution. There were only 5 of these amendments, which had been mostly forgotten, but which intrigued Watson. The first was called the Congressional Pay Amendment. This amendment was originally proposed by James Madison back in 1787. It would have made it unconstitutional for Congress to give itself an immediate pay raise. The second one, also proposed by Madison, was called the Congressional Apportionment Amendment.
it would have provided a very mathematically complex formula for reapportioning the U.S. House of Representatives.
If it had actually been ratified, we'd have thousands and thousands of members of Congress today.
You couldn't even get all the members into the Capitol building.
The third unratified amendment passed in 1810 was called the Titles of Nobility Amendment. There was also a Child Labor Amendment from 1926, and, most horrifying, the Corwin Amendment.
From the year 1861, had it been ratified, it would have forever enshrined in the Constitution the institution of slavery,
preserving it forever in the states where it was still legal at the time. In his paper, Watson argued that these forgotten amendments could still be revived, and a decade later, in 1992, he proved this to be true when he successfully got the Congressional Pay Amendment ratified as the 27th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Kenneth Burns is a great documentarian. Maybe you've seen some of his work. It's magnificent. But he once argued, where did I hear this? I think I heard it on the We the People podcast about the Supreme Court and about constitutional law. He argued once that the best way to change somebody's mind is not to prevent facts and allegory, facts and statistics, but instead provide them stories. Storytelling is the best way to change somebody's mind. And that's really what constitutional this podcast sets out to do. Now, it's not looking to change your mind about the Constitution unless your opinion is that the Constitution is a static document that barely reflects our interests and it just sits there dispassionately as a reservoir of wisdom. And her podcast is an effective storytelling device that shows us just how faulty this document is, primarily because it's been written by incredibly faulty people. Now, what we got a chance to do, originally we arranged to have Lillian Cunningham, who engineers this podcast herself over the course of a year. 19 episodes, I believe. Fantastic. Every episode's amazing, as you can tell. These are little snippets of them. Obviously, the podcast, you don't get the visual aids. But she herself agreed to be Skyped today and get an interview, as have us as a collective ask her any questions, have her weigh in on the themes that she explored in this podcast. Unfortunately, she canceled. And so we were able to interview her and record the interview last week, and this is the result of the interview. All right. Hi, Lillian Cunningham of the Washington Post. Thank you for joining us so much for this Constitution Day here at OTC.
It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh man, I've been tracking you down for a while. I really enjoyed the great work you've done on this podcast, and look forward to, I know you're working on a new one now, so looking forward to what you're working on now. With me is Clouse and Celeste Erwin. These are 2 members of Politically Active, and we all wanted to talk to you a bit about the great work you've done. So let me ask you about that. What caused you to create this podcast and tell these stories?
Sure. Well, I've been at the Washington Post about 8 years now, and before I did the constitutional podcast, the very first podcast I did for the Post was a podcast called Presidential, and I did that one in 2016 in the election year, and the idea behind that was to, go back and study every single American president. I did it over the course of 44 weeks, and it was sort of a study in presidential leadership and also the evolution of the office of the presidency. And at the time when I did that, I thought it was just this sort of one-off project. I had been a print reporter and thought I would go back to doing that, but I enjoyed podcasting as a medium so much, and a lot of listeners to that podcast sort of recommended that I keep doing it and threw out ideas for another series. And one of the ideas that they threw out was to do something sort of like I had done for presidential, but for the Constitution, and kind of go back through and chart the people, the figures, the big fights, the sort of important moments in the story of the Constitution. So that idea sounded like exciting and challenging and intriguing enough to me that I dedicated the next year of my life to doing that one.
Lillian, as you know, there are lots of podcasts about the Constitution, not even really good. But really what sets yours apart from the others, in my opinion, is the vividness with which you describe this swirling passions and the humanity that have created and continue to shape the Constitution. Tell us why you choose to emphasize the humanity in these stories and the drama in these stories as much as you do, rather than some of the more dry legal wrangling.
Right. Well, first, I mean, thank you. That's so kind, and I'm so glad it achieved that for you. And you know, I think we do have a tendency to see the Constitution as something that's dusty and dry. It's, you know, a governing document that's a set of rules and procedures. You know, but the fact is that it's the roadmap for what we want to be as a nation and who, you know, we as citizens can be as part of this nation. And so I think, you know, it's anything but dry and dusty, and the best way to get at really the spirit of what the document is about is to focus on people. So, you know, certainly it's one thing to put in the Declaration of Independence that, you know, our values are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but to me the Constitution is all about sort of wrestling with, well, how do we live that? And that's where I think all of these really exciting and important stories about people come in, because we, you know, we tend to think of the Constitution as a document that was written by, you know, the founders and constitutional framers 230 plus years ago, but it's a document that's alive, that so many people in the past 200 plus years have contributed to. They've either, you know, fought for amendments, or they've brought cases before the courts that changed our understanding of words that were written into that document, you know, centuries ago. So to me, the best way to bring it to life and actually to just show that it is a living document is to focus on all of those people who've touched it and shaped it in some way. So I'm glad that I'm glad that the podcast felt like it carried that sort of humanity and sort of personal sort of drama with it.
You know, it felt to me like a drama podcast, and it just happened to be about the Constitution. And there's so many, like you said, you like to tell stories about these very fascinating people, and there are just too many great stories to recount in this interview. But I would argue the best one, in my opinion, is the one you end up telling about an individual named Standing Bear as he was fighting literally for his humanity in the court system. So what led you that story, and how deeply did this story affect you?
I would say that probably is the story that has stuck with me most. But it's, you know, what's amazing about it is it's a story I didn't know at all until I started doing research for the podcast. And for anyone watching this who hasn't listened to that episode, Standing Bear was the chief of a Ponca tribe during the late 1800s, and he and his tribe were forced onto sort of a military government-run reservation, and his son dies in one of the camps, and he sets out with his son's body to bury it in their ancestral homeland. And he gets arrested in the process, and this question goes before a judge, which is basically should Native Americans be treated as human beings under the US Constitution? And it's kind of mind-blowing to think that that could even be a question put before the court, but it gives us some indication of how many questions the Constitution did not sort of answer at its beginning. And that story, I mean, it's one of, I mean, I think there are a lot of powerful stories in the podcast, but to me that was not just a powerful story, but it was also powerful in that it's remarkable so few of us know that story. And the way I came across it actually is, which shows a little bit of my process, I guess, for creating the podcast, is, you know, I do a ton of research and reading, but then I also talk to, you know, as many experts as I can, and I ask everyone's recommendation I can for, you know, what I should read next or what I should study up on. And so that was a story that had been flagged for me by an editor here actually at the Post who spent time in Nebraska, and she knew a scholar who had studied Standing Bear's story, and so it was sort of this circuitous path to it. But as soon as I started reading about his tale, I felt like it had to make its way into the podcast. I wanted the podcast to, you know, be a mix of stories that we're somewhat familiar with, like women's suffrage is one that we talked about, but that I think more people sort of know a bit better. And then stories like this one that are hidden and really need to be surfaced.
I have a question. Have we as a nation kept the moral values our founding fathers have placed within us? I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I feel like that's the question that's kind of at the very heart of our country and this ongoing experiment that is American democracy. And, you know, I think for us today, but also in every era, we had to sort of answer that question for ourselves of like, are we living out these constitutional values? And so, you know, the values of promoting the general welfare, or striving toward a more perfect union, or being a country with justice. And I mean, I guess my answer would be probably similar to many people's answers, which is that, you know, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. We're not a perfect union. And for every story I came across where it seems like we moved closer to being that perfect union, there are stories I came across that felt like, you know, we took steps backward. So I think the trick really is just that kind of every person has a different answer for themselves about what progress toward that more perfect union looks like, and we're not there. We're not there yet, so we probably will never be there. But that's sort of what we as engaged citizens have to participate in, is asking ourselves, you know, what would it look like for us to better live out those ideals? And everyone has a different answer to what that looks like, which is why we have debate and discussion in this country about how we move forward.
Thank you.
My question's kind of long. So in the podcast Fair Punishment, comment was made about the Mississippi Delta being the darkest corner of the South with the most racial violence and the hardest state to integrate. And then one of the ones that kind of stuck out to me was that looking at Mississippi as the epitome of the racism and brutality against African Americans. Personally, I've always considered that place to be Alabama, specifically the area surrounding Birmingham, otherwise known as Bombingham. So what kind of led you to the conclusion that the Mississippi Delta was that place that was the center of the racial tension and violence?
Wow, yeah, so that episode, just if people need a little background, that episode was one in which I explored the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and specifically told the story of this penitentiary in Mississippi called Apportionment Farm, and some of the punishments that were doled out to prisoners there. And, you know, I don't know that I can say whether Alabama or Mississippi is sort of a better symbol for racial violence and unrest in this country, but unfortunately I think there are a lot of places that at different moments in the country's history have told that story horribly well. But I did find that the people that I spoke to for that Apportionment Farm episode, I think sort of the point that they were making was not that, it was less about the point that Mississippi is sort of the worst place in America, or was at that point, and it was more just about how this story about the treatment of prisoners there kind of stood in for many places. I mean, there were prisons in Louisiana too that are known for having the same sort of brutal practices as in Mississippi. But, you know, what I tried to do was to find just an example to sort of zero in on that helped tell a story that unfortunately in many of these cases actually is representative of similar stories that have played out in different parts of the country at different points in our history. I don't know if that helps answer it.
That makes a lot more sense.
So I know each of these episodes you poured a lot of effort into. It's got to be impossible for you to choose any one to stand out in your mind. But Lillian, if you had to pick one, which one provided you a revelation or a moment or just a little something extra that you feel you'll carry with you for the rest of your life? I know we've already spoken about Standing Bear.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably two of the ones that would have come to mind first are two that were just mentioned, the Standing Bear episode and the Apportionment Farm episode. And I don't know what it says about me, but I guess what those have in common is that they're both pretty heart-wrenching stories that I think that will just stay with me in a really sort of visceral, emotional way for a long time. And stories that I think inspire us to hopefully be a better nation if we understand those parts of our history. But the other thing that I would say that I haven't mentioned yet, but that stands out to me as kind of a memory from the podcast that will stick with me, was just the opportunity to interview Congressman John Lewis. And I spoke to him for the civil rights episode that I did. And it's a privilege of being a journalist and, you know, a newsroom like you see behind me, the Washington Post, where I get to talk to, you know, these people who are such integral parts of shaping the country's history. And, you know, I get to live in Washington, D.C. and be right down kind of the street from the Capitol building. And so to be able to sit in the office with someone like Congressman Lewis, who's, you know, played such an important role in shaping the country's progress on racial equality, that's the kind of privilege and opportunity that, you know, I think I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, just the chance that I had to talk to someone like that.
He's living history.
Yeah.
You talked to a couple people that are living history. One of my favorite stories about the Constitution, I was so happy you told us about the 27th Amendment. And a guy who took a political science class and took it upon himself to change his grade in the most elaborate way possible. Do you want to take a moment to talk about that? That's literally my favorite story about the
Sure, that one, that I feel like is just a purely uplifting, great story from the podcast and, well, from our country's history. But that is the story of this guy, like you said, Gregory Watson, who was a student at the University of Texas. And in doing research for one of his college classes, he came across the fact that, way back at